Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about a site in a location which extends the concept of the Scottish borders a little bit, but bear with me. To give you a little bit of background, wetland archaeology in Scotland has focused almost exclusively on the Crannog, which, as you probably all know, is an island usually artificially constructed with structures on top. And this photograph here shows the classic Crannog, a sort of scrubby covered island in the middle of a loch. The work of the Scottish Wetland Archaeology Programme over the past decade in southwest Scotland on numerous sites has gone a long way to demonstrating the variability in construction, morphology and location that's subsumed under that label Crannog. And the site that I'm going to talk about today, the Black Loch of Myrton, is challenging even further our preconceptions of the nature of wetland settlement in Scotland. So first of all, location. The site lies in the southwest of Scotland on the Machars Peninsula. You can see Stranraer up at the top and Whithorn down at the bottom of the peninsula. It lies on the west coast of the Machars, just inland, and on the Monreath estate. There's two bodies of water there. There's the White Loch of Myrton, which is a big, deep loch, which also has a classic Crannog in that we've investigated. But down where the arrow is the Black Loch of Myrton. And this is depicted as an open pool of water in the mid-19th century, but the area has been drained frequently by the landowners, and now it's more like a bog, and it's dry enough to support scrub woodland. And in fact, the current farmer undertook a new drainage scheme in 2010, and that's what drew our attention back to the site. The Black Loch has been referred to as a Crannog since the 19th century, when the landowner, Herbert Maxwell, carried out an investigation into a group of mounds in this boggy area. I've actually put the quotation from his very, very brief report down there, because what he describes is almost exactly what we went on to find. We've now excavated, or partially excavated, two of the mounds, which are the pink blobs on this survey. And this has demonstrated that both of the mounds are roundhouses, and both of them have been built directly onto the peat surface, the natural peat surface. So this is therefore not a Crannog in the classic sense, because there are no artificial foundations to the settlement. We've been calling the site a lochside settlement and a loch village in some ways to draw attention to the comparisons between it and Glastonbury, a more famous Iron Age loch village in Somerset. And we'd assumed that it had been built on the edge of the peat, which was gradually filling in the small loch. But last summer, we had a team from Southampton University who carried out a very extensive programme of coring to model the extent and depth of the original loch. And what this has shown is that the settlement is sitting on a very low, peaty promontory, which is projecting out into what probably even by then was just wet marsh rather than open water. And Graham, my colleague, carried out this topographic survey earlier this year when the vegetation was down. And I think the promontory is clear. I haven't got you can see at the very bottom of the area that he's marked out, you can see the sort of neck, the natural promontory on the dry land to the south. As I said, we've now partially excavated two of the mounds, Structure 1 in Trench 1 in 2013 and Structure 2 in Trench 2 last year. And the results of the 2013 survey season are fully processed, all the post-excavations done. And then, so a lot of what I'm going to present today rests on the results of that season. The excavations have demonstrated that each of these mounds consists of a massive stone hearth complex which sits at the centre of a timber roundhouse. And this shows Structure 1 with the primary hearth in the centre. You can see a sort of mound of cobbles and the timber floor surrounding it. The construction consisted of a lot of stone slabs set down in a rectilinear foundation to form the foundation of the hearth. And around this, a sort of corduroy surface of very large alder logs were laid down. And you're looking at the logs over there, you can see that they're lying on the peat surface. And extending west from the central platform was a radial structure of alder timbers, which had been, again, laid directly down on the surface of the peat. And in between those, there are sort of tangential bundles of branches. This house is quite poorly preserved, as you'll see when we come to structure 2. The hearth mound sits over in the sort of left-hand corner there. The evidence for the superstructure of the house consists of an internal postering and 2 outer stakelines. And the oak posts from the postering are very, very unusual design. As you can see, instead of a sharpened tip, they've got concave bases, as though they were designed to sit over horizontal logs. And I've certainly never seen this type of design in any of the other wetland sites that I've seen. And there are the 2 stake lines that form the outer walls of the house in the foreground there, picked out with garden tags. And in this photograph, you can probably see the mound more clearly, created by the stacked hearths. Jake's sitting on the excavated portion of the hearth, but you can see the massive mound to one side of him. And the mound at the centre of the structure has been created by the construction of 3 massive stone hearths, one on top of the other. I think that's very clear from the 2 sections. Each consisted of a mound of loose cobbles contained within a curb of very large boulders, and the surface was either a layer of clay or a very large grey wacky slab placed on top of the cobble mound. The hearth mound eventually stood to over 1.1 metres high. And over time, the hearth complex must have caused it to sink, or perhaps rather more the peat to compact underneath it. And this is presumably why it was rebuilt frequently. I think in the section, you can perhaps see the natural peat dipping down on either side of it. And this is the final hearth, just to give you some idea of the massive scale. You can see the huge curbs around here and the grey wacky slabs which form the surface. They're rectilinear and they're about between 2.5 to 2 metres across. Even before the post-excavation programme began, it was clear that there was a pronounced asymmetry in construction around the circuit of the house. We've got very different types of surface around the hearth. So I'm not sure if it's clear here, but in around hearth 1, we've got a lot of wooden corduroy paving. Come hearth 2, there's a lot of stone on the southeast, but not on the southwest. Up in the northeast, we just seem to have a mess of timbers. They're quite distinct. All of this suggests spatial organisation around the house, maybe distinct activity areas. And this has been borne out by the post-excavation work. The macro plants, the insects and the soil-thin sections show that the occupation deposits in the southwest and the northeast halves of the house are strikingly different. We've got sedges and rushes used as flooring in the northeast, grasses and leaves in the southwest. In the southwest, we have food and hearth debris trampled around, big spillages. These are the dots that you can see in the central one. But there's no evidence of that sort of activity up in the northeast half. And also, artefact distribution is also confined to the southwest and southeast halves of the sides of the hearth. We have no artefacts up in the northeast corner. So that's what we know about structure 1. Structure 2, which lies only a few metres to the east of structure 1, displays many of the features observed in structure 1, but it's much, much better preserved in places. Where Hannah and Tom are digging at the top there, the timbers are sitting directly on the peat and they're quite decayed, but you can see there's a sort of trajectory to better preservation down in the corner where you can see the withy screens beginning to emerge. It's very similar in size. Structure 1 was 11.7 metres and structure 2 is 12 metres. We've got the double stakeline forming the outer wall as well. That's the inner stakeline visible. You can see the mound, the hearth mound in the background there. And in a post ring. And again, all the posts on this post ring were also of that concave design, which we think is presumably an adaptation to building on soft foundations. I mentioned the evidence for spatial division in structure 1, but these tangential timbers that you can see around, set in between the posts, would have made a very substantial division between the inner area around the hearth, which you can see down in the bottom here, and the outer periphery. This is the best preserved of those tangential timbers, and you can see how neatly jointed they are into the uprights. And you can see that there are stakes for an eternal division. So these are sillbeams, in other words. What we don't know is whether the internal division went all the way up to the roof. Was it a waist-high division or ankle-high division? That's something we can only guess at. What has also survived in much better condition in structure 2 are the floor levels. You can see the sort of hurdle screen at the back here. That's not the screen from this sillbeam that's collapsed downwards. That's a screen that's been laid down deliberately as a subfloor, and on top of that, masses of plant litter have been built up to create a floor. And underneath the ranging rod, you can see a wodge of the material. And it was amazing. You could pull it apart, and you could see the sort of sedges and rushes quite distinctly. Say structure 2 is also dominated by a huge hearth mound. There were 4 hearths in this structure, all built in very similar fashion to those in structure 1. We couldn't get down to the earliest, we could only just glimpse it because of water levels, but you can see the second hearth here, hearth 3, built within a timber framework, mound of cobbles, and then a clay surface. And in the next hearth, they've built almost like a halo of stones, possibly as a sort of fire retardant or something, packed it with clay, and then with the big stones on top of that. As with structure 1, the weight of these hearth mounds compressed the peak below, and so the floor levels around them were constantly having to be rebuilt. And what you're looking at in this section are multiple floor surfaces. At the very bottom, you can see it's the edges of the hurdle screens, the first one to be laid down on the peak floor. And then above that, just behind the scale, is a huge deposit of plant litter. And then above that, you can see another hurdle screen floor, and then another patch of floor litter. And at some point, there must have been a big fire, and we've got a very thick layer of charcoal, and they just seem to have given up on the organic material at that point, and they lay down a floor of orange clay. I should say that the hearth mound lies to the left of that picture. And I've included here a thin section from Cults Loch, which is one of the other cranogs that we've investigated in southwest Scotland. And I've put it there to show that what looks like sort of a very homogeneous grey deposit, when you see it in the thin section, you can see all the tiny layers of flooring. And we might be looking at many seasons of refurbished flooring in those deposits. And this is the overall plan of structure 2. So you can see the central hearth, the double stakeline of the outer wall, the post ring and the posts, and the subfloor, the wickerwork screens of the subfloor in place. So far, we haven't uncovered the entrance to either of the structures, but in structure 2, we think that it might lie down on the southwest side, just at the bottom here. This would make sense because it faces into the sort of central area between all of the mounds. And we've also found these very weird structures. Down at the bottom here, we've got a set of oak planks which have been set upright in between the two stake lines. And I've put a photograph there of one of them being excavated. And what we think is that these might be forming like an oak facade on either side of the entrance. And we're going back there next for the most of June, and this is going to be one of our target areas to try and figure out where and what the entrance is. So dating, so far we don't have any date for structure 2. But for structure 1, we had one radiocarbon date initially from one of the posts in the post ring, which showed that it was falling in the mid-first millennium BC within that flat part of the Hallstatt plateau, so not very useful. But luckily, we've been able to dendrodate a group of planks, and we've got a felling date of sometime between 461 and 429 BC. We've also had a student at Glasgow who's been doing wiggle match dating of some of the timbers, and he's wiggle match dated some of those big foundation timbers that you saw earlier, and he's coming up with a date of construction between 520 and 435 BC. So the house was built and constructed and probably used within a few decades in the mid-5th century BC. These dates make it virtually contemporary with Cults Loch 3, another crannog at Castle Kennedy near Stranraer. And here, this is a bar diagram of the data from there, and the oaks were felled between 438 and 412 BC. So the two sites were built virtually contemporaneously. Now, this issue of contemporaneity becomes critical when we come to consider the nature of the settlement at Black Loch. Because it doesn't have an artificial foundation, it could be viewed as a proto-crannog. They're trying out settlement in the open water, but they're just using a natural peaty promontory. But if it was built at the same time as Cults Loch, which it appears to be, then, which is a more classic crannog with an artificial foundation, then it must surely represent another settlement variant, but one that required being surrounded by water. So the question is, why would you live out on the water? And I certainly don't have enough time to go into all of the arguments, but I can sort of point out certainly some of the disadvantages. I mean, living out on the peat required structural adaptations, such as those concave base posts. Subsidence was clearly a problem, forcing the rebuilding of the hearth several times, levelling up the floor, laying down thick layers of plant litter as insulation, because it must have been very damp and uncomfortable at times. And I can tell you in the summer, which is when we've been digging, it's still not very pleasant out there. Seasonal occupation is one possibility, but very, very difficult to demonstrate. And even so, as you've seen from the scale of the hearths, that's a lot of effort to go to build, for a summer house or a bothy. And the builders could simply have built an earth-fast roundhouse on the more stable, dry foundations on the slopes around the loch. This is the only AP that I could find, and the site is where the red star is up there, and the patch below it is probably the old loch basin. This is White Loch down here. But as you can see, there would have been plenty of room for anyone who wanted to build an ordinary roundhouse. If the occupants represented a different socio-economic stratum or section of society, one might expect to see differences in their material remains, in their equipment, their diet, and their structures. But apart from the location in a wet, boggy area, there's very little to distinguish the settlement at Black Loch from other contemporary settlements in the area. The houses are no different to their dry land equivalents in plan, at least. I've put up two examples of local roundhouses, Cults Loch, which I say is at Castle Kennedy, and Risbane Camp, which is only a few miles away from Black Loch. Both of them roundhouses, 13 metres in diameter, so very similar, both with post ring structures. These could be exactly the same as the houses that we're finding at Black Loch. The material culture in southwest Scotland in the later prehistoric period is notoriously very poor. And in that respect, the artefact and assemblages from Black Loch differ very little from those of other dryland sites in the region. It's dominated by an assemblage of coarse stone tools and querns, examples of which you can see up there. And we do have more evidence for agriculture in the form of this iron ardshare tip down at the bottom there. And we have evidence that a range of cereal crops were being cultivated and then processed and consumed: barley and emmer, spelt, and wheat, bread club wheat. The only item which is unusual is this little, very poorly fired clay thumb pot. And I was going to say that it was the first ceramic artefact to be found on a later prehistoric site in southwest Scotland, but Roland tells me that they found some ceramics at Dunragit. Until recently, the area has been considered a ceramic, and even so, these, I think, are the only two sites that we know have produced ceramics. One interesting thing from the site that's emerged are what we're calling the shiny quartz pebble culture. We have a lot of local volunteers on the site, and they started bringing up these quartz pebbles, and we were bagging them almost to keep them happy. But in fact, we've discovered that there are something like 80 or 90 of them, and we found them in caches, and they all come from under those hurdle screens. They look as though they've been putting them down as sort of foundation deposits before the building of the house. And we realised, having seen the extent of it here, we also had it at Cults Loch, but not so extensively. As a loch village, rather than a crannog, Black Loch represents an entirely new site type in Scotland, but it's almost certainly not unique. It's just that they haven't been recognised until now. And a very brief review of the antiquarian literature reveals the example of Dowalton Loch, which is only a few miles away from Black Loch, and which already contains a numerous classic crannogs. So Miller's Cairn there is a sort of a proper crannog. But on the east shore, it has this scatter of stone mounds. And I've put the excavator, Lord Louvain, this is a quote from his report, and he talks about these little cairns surrounded by piles and appears to be single dwellings. And this seems to me, he's describing another Black Loch. And just to bring it closer to home, and before I end, Trevor Cowie drew my attention to this site at the Moss of Whiteburn in the Spottiswoode estate in Berwickshire, excavated in the 19th century. It was described as a layer of timbers radiating out from a central point and with stakes around the perimeter, and had been laid down on the clay under the peat. What's most interesting to me is that they report that 3 such structures were found. So again, we may be looking at a village. And even more so, and I quote, "A great deal of withered grass and fern matted together was observed." And this sounds to me very much like the type of flooring material that we were finding at Black Loch. So having brought it back to the borders, I'll finish at that point with thanks to all the people who have made it possible. Thank you.